Now what I'm thinking is to take, this is the flywheel off the Om617. This is a flywheel off the gasoline engine. I'm going to have to take some off the back of this, not a ton, but a little bit. I'm thinking about just stacking these two flywheels, drilling this bolt pattern here in this flywheel, and of course this is a clutch that goes in here, and it looks like that it's probably going to be able to work. There's not about to lose that transmission. The Om617 flywheel, like I say, just sticks out of the back of the engine just about 1/8 of an inch, maybe 1/4. But on the Ford, the whole flywheel sticks out the back. As you can see, as it bolts on here, the whole thing hangs out the back of the engine. In fact, there's about a 1/4 inch gap. You know, if it was on here, you could almost stick your little finger in right there. And so stacking these flywheels and bolting all that together and having that extra flywheel hanging out the back here is actually going to put it in the ballpark as far as being spaced correctly. I don't know if you can hear me hardly, but it's kind of interesting. You can't put a dial indicator on this because it's got holes all in it, and there's just not enough, you know, anywhere you put it, it's going to run off the edge here, you know, and fall in a hole or whatever. It wouldn't work. The only easy way I know to do this is just to spin it by hand and run up here with a sharp tool you can mark it with. Anyway, I come up here and touched off here and turned it. It touches here. I don't know if you can hardly see this. Comes around, the mark goes away, the mark comes back right there, touches it for a little while and goes away, and the mark is gone all the way back past where I cut that chunk off. Anyway, this is kind of interesting. This wasn't even flat from forward. It's probably at least 5 thousandths out. Anyway. Well, I'm here working on this bell housing. Of course, you saw the previous video. This is a couple of days after I actually did the machining. But I've got a couple of bolt holes here. You can't see through there. I got a good 3/8 bolt hole here. The top two are going to go all the way through this plate into the block. Anyway, I think this is going to work, but it just needs some stiffening up. Here's a piece that I took my grinder. I know this is a horrible job. I just took a grinder and a cutoff wheel and cut this piece out of the old transmission. I spent forever doing this, and it sort of sits in there, lines up, and I get a weld here and here, And along the inside, I'm going to trim this off here a little bit, and here. Anyway, I'm going to try to weld all this out, and I'm going to put some weld. This little lip here is really thin. There's not hardly left. I'm going to put a bead here, maybe stack a couple there, a couple here, anywhere else I can find. It looks like I could do some beefing up. Of course, the two rings that I've machined is what centers this, so it doesn't really need any dowel pins, which it doesn't have. Like I say, I've got these 3 bolt holes. I'm using this sort of as a guide right now. I'm going to stick the bolts in it to keep this thing oriented where the transmission is level and facing up. Anyway, I'm gonna drag my machine over here. So you can tell I bead blasted this. I want to take some wax and grease solvent and wipe it down and try to weld this. I haven't welded any aluminum in probably a year or longer, and I was mediocre at best. And I think a big grease-soaked chunk of aluminum is about the hardest thing there is to weld. Anyway, I don't have another helmet to put the camera where you can see what I'm doing anyway, and I'd probably look like an idiot. So I will catch you on the other side, as they say. Well, I got it done. It was about as big of a disaster as I expected. You know, I don't know if I showed you. There was a big gap here, and it was sort of a V, you know, in both directions. And I just started welding on here, you know, back and forth, and finally got that filled up. And that looks horrible. Of course, it's probably okay. I mean, I think it's reasonably strong. Of course, I put this in a bead blaster. Now you can't even hardly see the beads, but I mean, like at first it was horrible, and it seemed like after I got the whole thing hot, it was a lot better. Now it was still a mess, and it was not not in good shape. But I mean, you know, I could weld it. It got to the point after I got the whole thing really hot that I could weld it. But it would just take, like you can see this porosity right here. You could just see that all the time you're welding. And anytime you got up on this metal, or either of these two, it would just foam, is the best way I could describe it. And it's a mess, I don't know. But anyway, like I say, once I got the whole thing hot, once I got one bead put on here, you know, this, you know, my original bead was probably down, you know, down like right in here. And after I got done, I tried to come up here and make another pass. Is really why this thing's so fat. It was only about, you know, originally it was only about that wide. And it just made a big old mess up here, and I said, well, heck with that. Anyway, I think this will work. I've got, you know, now I've got these 2 bolts. This is where the starter actually bolts to the engine, using this Ford bell, or the Mercedes bell housing. These 2 bolts up here, it's kind of dark, you can't hardly see them standing in the light. These 2 bolts up here go, like I say, through this into the block. This has got a good mounting point there. I think that'll hold it. That's really, you know, originally the Ford only had these 4, you know, there was one here, and then this one, and this one, and this one. It only had 4 bolts. So anyway, it's probably as good as it was originally. So anyway, it's about the size of it. Okay, I just got back from my machine shop working on these flywheels. This flywheel here is a stock flywheel off the Om617 Mercedes. The only big problem, or the only big the thing that's got to be right, well, for one, it's got to be balanced, but I'm going to take it to a machine shop with a balancer to balance it, but was to make sure that the clutch is spaced off of the transmission correctly, so that it's spaced correctly into the bell housing of the transmission. And this worked out much easier than would be typical, because as I was describing yesterday on the other video, this flywheel sits inside the little aluminum bell housing thing, what do you call that, on the back of the Mercedes. And the Ford flywheel fits outside of the back of the engine. So I was basically able just to stack these, stacking one on top of the other, put this flywheel outside of the engine or into the bell housing of the transmission too far, by about almost 3/8 of an inch. And so what I did, as you can see, I had a clearance here, these little weights or whatever they were. I had to clearance that so the flywheel will fit inside here. This had a pretty good step. I don't know if you can see. It's about, well, it was I think it was like 170 thousandths that I took off just from touching off on my machine, set it to 0, about 170 or whatever. Anyway, I set this back in as far as I could, basically flushed it out with this. On the other flywheel, this stuck out here, had a thing that stuck out pretty good here. I took about almost 1/8 of an inch off of here, or something like that. I've forgotten, I don't remember exactly. Anyway, I had to clearance, these to make everything fit. Obviously this little ring is 100 thousandths off of here. I tried to give 100 thousandths clearance just because it's an easy number to remember. And then this step here, this is, I don't know if you can tell, but this here is actually stepped up off of here a little bit. It's got 100 thousandths clearance and about 100 between this face and this face. The bolt pattern here, this Mercedes uses a 12 bolt pattern. The Ford used a 6. As you can tell, this looks really weird. I re-drilled this pattern and this flywheel. Obviously there's 6 bolts in metal, and they're round. These other 6 holes, I went ahead and lined up. There was enough room, I think, to put the 2 bolt holes between, like one here and one here, but that would have more holes than I thought needed to be in this. I machined all this too with the idea of trying to make it as strong as possible. I didn't want to take this lip here all the way to the edge. I was afraid it would weaken it. I took as much material as I dared off of here. I didn't measure how thick this is left. It's probably, almost 3/8 of an inch or something, thickness of the cast iron there. Anyway, I took as much as I dared off here. When I stack these and bolt this all together, this is actually going to be deeper into the bell housing of the transmission than it was originally, but not by much. My measurements, which are not super accurate, because the only way you can measure some of this stuff, or the only easy way, the way I did it, was I laid straight edges across a lot of this and measured off, this caliper with the end of a caliper. But per my measurements, which are probably not very close as far as a machinist would be concerned, but are close enough for a clutch, comes out to about 55 thousandths. And I would say accuracy on that is probably plus or minus 10. And I really don't think that a 1/16 of an inch is going to make any difference whatsoever. But, and I'll show you later, I could possibly take and build a 1/16 shim and put a shim between the bell housing of the transmission and the transmission case itself, so that the transmission is exactly the same length away from the engine. That's still going to have the clutch throwout fork closer to the clutch itself, but I can't imagine a 1/16 or an 1/8 or probably even a 1/4 mattering. Anyway, this OD here is stock Mercedes OD. I forgot what it was. I bored this out to be about a 1/2 thousandth under this size, and then I hit it with some with some emery cloth and probably took a 1/4 to the 1/2 thousandth out, so it's about the same size as this. It's just a little bit snug. Obviously you can orient this any way you want to for balancing it. See, this Ford flywheel is externally balanced, or the engine is externally balanced. I guess you can maybe see it's got a couple holes drilled here. You know, but it's supposed to be heavier on one side than the other. The Om617 is internally balanced. It's supposed to be, the flywheel is balanced, you know, from originally. Anyway, so I'll take this to the machine shop. They can orient this whichever way to balance it the easiest. Anyway, you can line the bolt holes up here, and it just takes about as hard as I can push on it, and it seats on there. That's about as least of a press fit, I think, as you could get. I didn't want it super tight because I figured it would probably have to come off and on a few times as it was balanced. Anyway, and then I know these bolt holes are screwed up like this one. Let me get you down here closer. You know, the bolt's not going to sit perfectly on that because it's got, you know, part of the original hole there. But anyway, I was hoping just to use this as a washer and bolt through both those flywheels. I think it'll work real well. I think this clutch is probably on the light end to be able to hold the power that this motor's going to put out, which is not much. It's like 135 horsepower or something like that. But I hope if I have trouble with this clutch that I can just have someone or somewhere remanufacture the clutch. Of course, I'm putting a new one in it, but rebuilding the clutch with heavier springs or different kind of friction material or whatever and make it work, I don't think that'll be a problem. But anyway, here's my flywheel. This is what I worked on. I spent nearly a whole day on this. I didn't work very long on it, only about an hour I'd actually machined, but I spent quite a few hours walking around with a tape measure and a pair of calipers and a straight edge and a notepad, kind of figuring out what exactly to do and how to go about building it. But anyway, that's this project done. Alright, here's a flywheel that's going on the engine. I've got to make a pilot bushing. I found that chunk of brass. I don't know what the heck that was. It's plugged or something. And I'm going to make one real quick. The housing bore of the flywheel is 35 millimeters, which is 1.377 and something. And I'm going to make this a couple thousandths press. I'm going to shoot for 1 inch 380, I guess. That'll give me 2 1/4 or something to that effect. Two 1/4 thousandths press is what I was saying. Flywheel grip depth 600. It's about 800 to this step. I think the 200 will be fine extra, so I'm just going to machine up this step. Here we go. cut. Turn that off where you hear me. I took on my final cut was 5 thousandths deep. And as you saw what I did, I went in, you know, probably 1/4 of an inch or so and stopped, took a measurement, didn't adjust anything, just backed the machine up. And so then when the machine goes in here to make this first 1/4 inch of cut that's already been cut, it'll actually undersize the front here a little bit. Like I say, I was shooting for about 1 inch 380 to 1 inch 329, preferably 1 inch 1 inch 380 to 1 inch 379. Preferably closer to the 80. It is measures 1 inch 379 and about 3/4. And you get out here on the edge, it's 1 inch 378. 1 inch 378 1/4. And so that undersized the end out here, which I did on purpose to help this start. When you go to press it or drive it in the flywheel, it makes it easier to start. Anyway, that's what I did there. And when you can measure it. You can take a 1/4 inch, go in a 1/4 inch in on your final cut and measure it, make sure it's going to be exactly where you want it. I got that within a 1/4 thousandth of what I aimed for. Not really working that hard. There we go. Nothing special. Inside bore of the finish on the board is not very good. May run some emery paper in or something. Anyway, I'll catch you back at my other shop. This is a flywheel that goes on the engine. Factory Om617. Pilot bushing. Fits great. I'm going to put a little bit of Loctite on it for good measure, though it probably doesn't need it. This will just make it a bigger pain to get out if I ever need to. Oh crap, I had a socket. Here it is. It's like a glove. It's protruding through slightly. Shouldn't be a problem. Can't beat that. Finally got all the junk gutted up to put these together. This is the first time this hasn't been pre-assembled for the video. What I was starting to say, this is the first time they're going together. So hopefully it works. If it's like any of the rest of my luck, it probably won't. Originally had bolts here that held the these bolts bolted through the bell housing adapter. I'm using studs now. They're all thread actually, so I can use a I'm going to run a nut all the way up here. Use it to hold this plate, and then as well, I don't know if that socket's going to be deep enough. These are going to go through the bell housing of the transmission. Barely. All right. I'll get this back around where y'all can see it here in just a second. Good Lord. All right, we're there. All right, well apparently my camera just died and I didn't know it. hopefully it got some video. So putting the transmission on this engine. Of course, I've got bolted this bell housing on. It's got several modifications to the. It's got some extra bolt holes and stuff in it. Of course, we talked about the stack flywheel. I got those oriented and bolted on here. I got the video on old driving the bushing in it. Anyway, next is the clutch. I assume that goes like this. I don't have a lineup tool for this clutch. This might be a little bit of a trick. Looks fairly close. But that'll probably go. Alright, I smeared grease all over the input shaft and greased the part, I don't know what you call it, the part that the throwout bearing slides on. Is this thing ready? Maybe. Here. Well, this may sound a little weird. These studs don't line up exactly with these holes. And I drilled these holes at a slight angle, but made the end of the hole end up in the same place. And so I may have some trouble pulling this up because it's going to have to sort of bend these bolts outward about 1/16, probably 1/8 of an inch a piece or something. it all pulled up pretty good. Like I say, that stud's a little bit short. I'm not exactly sure what to do about that. Probably just leave it. It's got a small gap here at the starter, but this bell housing's thin enough, I bet it'll pull up, and at the bolt holes it's made up. This ultimately is just sort of a cover to fill up this big hole. So I'll have a good bolt here, 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 and this one goes all the way through as well. That's as much as the Ford had originally. You can see the gear teeth just barely clear. 100,000ths. Anyway, I'm gonna stuff it in the car.